Well, thank you so much, everyone who is joining us. Thank you, Jim, for giving us some of your precious time and sharing with us your fabulous experience. I'm going to start by introducing you, if I may. So we have with us today Ambassador Jim Jeffrey. He is the chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey has a long career as a diplomat. He served as our ambassador to Syria, to Iraq, our ambassador to Turkey, our ambassador to Albania, and the secretary is the special representative for Syria. He held various senior assignments in Washington and abroad, including Deputy National Security Advisor, United States Ambassador, as I mentioned, to several countries. And he has the highest rank in the US Foreign Service, which is Career Ambassador. Ambassador Jeffrey is originally from Massachusetts. He has a BA in History from Northwestern University and an MBA from Boston University Graduate School of Management. He also has a diploma in French from the University of Paris. In addition to English, he speaks French, German, and Turkish. Thank you so much for joining us, Ambassador. And you are going to share with us today, you were our ambassador also to the Coalition to Defeat ISIS. And today you'll be sharing with us how we went about this phenomenal task against a global terrorist organization. I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Nadia. It's great to see my colleague, a former colleague at the Wilson Center, Professor Ouidat, and it's really great to see everybody from out there at Kansas State tuning in this evening. What I'm going to do is start, not so much with the campaign against ISIS, I'll get to that, but the dramatic events in international relations, and then explain why the lessons that we have learned in the last phase of our global war on terror, how to deal successfully with irregular warfare, will be determinant not only on how we deal with specific campaigns and the strategic competition we have facing us, but that the whole strategic competition with Russia and China and their regional sidekicks, Iran and North Korea, is going to follow, for the most part, unless we're very, very unlucky in a general war, the basic rules of irregular warfare. So once again, what we've learned, particularly in the successful fight against the Islamic State, should be helpful more broadly. So let me start with the fact that Ukraine is the most significant international affairs event, even more than 9/11, since the fall of the wall, in terms of its dramatic impact on the whole world. In another sense, however, it's the most important event since 1945. If you look at this from a broad geostrategic foreign policy, decades and centuries long perspective. The world after 1945, and I'll get to that in some detail, was formed with American leadership, but with participants from all over the world to respond to, reflect upon, and learn from the lessons of the horrific period of great power competition from the 19th century until its denouement over Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then Potsdam in 1945, to avoid ever again a world war and great powers engaging in aggression. Despite all of the problems during the Cold War, we never had any of the major powers launch a major offensive war against a UN member state. Not in the Korean War, not with us going into Iraq, none of that really meets that criteria. And that's why the Russian invasion of Ukraine is so dramatically significant. So let me take a step back and talk a bit about when the administration finally releases the Biden national security strategy, and we've been waiting now for almost 2 years for it, will largely be focused on, from everything we're hearing, is what is now called strategic competition. It used to be called great power competition. Now, this kind of strategic or great power competition in history has taken three basic forms from my pretty superficial review of history. One is a system of states vying with each other. That's Europe from roughly the 15th century until, again, 1945. No single one of them dominated, and alliances were constantly formed and wars fought as they each tried to get advantage over the other. Some ascending, some declining, but all of them in the mix. Second is a struggle between two nations. From classical history, we know several of them. One is the Persians and the Greeks, 500 years before the modern era. Another was Rome and Carthage a few centuries later. What is the third? We've seen mostly in the Cold War from 1945 until China dropped out in 72 and Russia collapsed or the Soviet Union collapsed in 1989 to 1991, is a regional or global system encompassing much of the world, or the known world's power and economic wealth being challenged from the outside. Again, the classic was the Cold War, but other examples, not quite as clear-cut, have been China for many centuries, with antagonists from the outside, largely from the steppes of Asia. Rome at its height as an empire encompassing much of Europe and most of the Middle East. And outside of Europe, the United Kingdom as a naval and trade and definer of rule of law system internationally in the 19th century after the defeat of Napoleon. So we have had some precursors, but the main one is the Cold War. And what we're seeing today is, in many respects, very, very similar. First of all, the two antagonists on the other side, the main ones, Russia and China, are the same, minus the communist ideology. It exists as an excuse in China, but believe me, it was really believed by many people, not only there, but around the world, up until the 1970s and 80s. But nonetheless, you have those two countries with their local allies. One is the same as during the Cold War, North Korea. Another one is relatively new to the mix, Iran, since 1979. It has been a challenge in the Middle East. And they all work together in various ways. Their enemy is not the United States per se. It's a global system. The center of it, as in all global systems in a world of essentially anarchy, is security, in this case, collective security, a system of alliances, in this case, with a major player at the center, the United States, which is the key ingredient in all of that in terms of both the structure of the alliances and the military power that's brought to bear. But many other countries participate. Central and South America and the Rio Treaty, obviously NATO, which is very, very active right now, and then what we call hub and spoke treaties and partnerships in the Middle East and Asia, from everybody from the Koreans and Japanese to the Israelis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and others. That system, however, is wrapped into a larger, deliberately into a larger, if you will, global order that has financial, monetary, trade being very important, rule of law, international organization, and other characteristics. This is all loose. Nobody is in charge of this per se, but we all know what it is. And together it forms, as I said, a global order with security at the core and all these other elements. And while it is somewhat self-governing in its own way, in a decentralized manner, it nonetheless is real when it really needs to be real, and we just have seen this with Ukraine. Now, the problem for those challenging the system, China and Russia, is that they are too big and too different in their governing philosophies to really adapt to a global system where they're not going to be the primary players. The primary players are the United States, the Europeans, Japan, and several other East Asian countries. and, if you will, this global order, international organizations, and everything else. They don't have the wherewithal, be it military, financial, political, ideological, or anything else, to truly conquer it, although China has been trying for almost a decade now to find a way, so far not successfully. So their main goal is to modify or pull down the system by launching all of government attacks on it. But they have to be very careful because in the nuclear age, too aggressive a posture could lead to a general war. And a general war has three problems. First of all, as we saw with World War I and II, it can lead to everybody being impoverished, or at least everybody but the United States. Two, it can turn out very badly for the aggressor, as Putin is learning right now, and as the Germans, Japanese, and Italians learned in World War II. And three, most dramatically, it can lead to a nuclear exchange. So they will avoid at all costs, that doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's unlikely, a major war with another superpower. Now, up until a few months ago, I didn't think any superpower would engage in a major war with anybody, and I was proven wrong. I hope I'm not proven wrong on a superpower to superpower war, but I think that the odds are against that. So that leaves them with a problem. How do they deal with this system that has, even when you throw China into the mix, over twice as much gross national product globally as these challenges have, far more military capability, far more technological capability, and an existing functioning global order. That doesn't mean every participant in it or beneficiary of it, from the Emiratis and the Saudis to India to Brazil, are going to be, trooping the colors with us and the British on a given issue. But what it means is that the system as a whole reacts badly when it's being challenged, and it's being challenged right now. So what they will do is, and we've seen this up until recently in Ukraine with some success by Putin, we've seen it in Syria. We see it so far in the Chinese campaign against Taiwan, including the very aggressive reaction to the Pelosi visit. We see it in the South China Sea. We saw it over a decade ago in Georgia, is an irregular warfare strategy to pick fronts where the global system is weak. A Georgia, strangely governed beyond easy military support, with a divided population, some of whom actually wanted to see the Russians move in. That's the kind of scenario they're looking for, another Vietnam, if you will, where the government is weak, the population is divided, and you can do two things. First of all, you can gain some territory or some power, and that's interesting. And certainly Ukraine, far more than Taiwan, Ukraine is a huge asset for Russia of 140 million people, with Ukraine's 40 million additional, highly educated, and as we've seen, very competent militarily population. But beyond that, the idea is you weaken and destroy the system. In Syria, you flaunt UN Security Council Resolution 2254 from 2015 that the Russians signed up to try to resolve it. In the South China Sea, you flaunt an international court in The Hague decision calling China out in very dramatic terms. By seizing Hong Kong, and now the pressure on Taiwan, you break agreements in the case of Hong Kong with Britain, in the case of Taiwan with the United States. In the case of Ukraine, a whole series of agreements, including a specific one on the basis of which in 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Russia was a signatory. So it's not that Russia and China are willing to pay the price of violating international norms to achieve their military successes. It's that part of their military success, as they see in a broader political sense, is tearing these norms up. These norms constrain them. These norms get in their way. These norms are problematic. On the other hand, if they can destroy these norms and get away with it, invade other countries without being called to task, they will just do it more and more. And this leads to the vulnerability of a collective security system. It is no stronger than the weakest link This is why we found ourselves in places like Laos and Vietnam in the 1960s, or in Nicaragua in 1983, and El Salvador. These were very weak places that were being challenged by the other side based upon the weak governments and divisions within the population. Also, the fact that they weren't all that important to the world at large meant that it was easier to throw down the gauntlet against the international order without the international order taking the risks of going to something like war to push back. And that is the first weakness. The second weakness of a collective security system is that when you have a central power, in the case of the current one, the United States, at the top of the heap, the system is no stronger than that power's willingness to go to bat for, from the standpoint of the United States, safe behind two world seas, a global island, if you will, extremely strong with almost all necessary resources, that global power is willing to engage in faraway conflicts, and its people are willing to engage in it because it's democracy. And that is what the Chinese and the Russians are targeting. We saw the same thing in the Cold War. In Vietnam, the Viet Cong, it was all about populations, but different populations for different reasons. The Viet Cong were challenging the Vietnamese government for the loyalty of the Vietnamese population. The North Vietnamese, while they certainly wanted to take over South Vietnam, were trying to challenge the American people by sending up the cost of getting involved in the war, and they were quite successful at that. The Soviets and the Chinese, in supporting the North Vietnamese, were targeting the American population by trying to show that our policy of global containment was not going to work and would deliver high costs and casualties and money, and to the rest of the world, deliver a message to its populations that the United States cannot be relied upon to be resolute and to stand up to penetrations of the global perimeter in faraway places. So the broader political issues are always important. Now, what did we learn from the fight against the Islamic State, which has been all in all a very successful fight from 2014 until the denouement of the Islamic State as a territorial force in early 2019, although I have to underline the Islamic State still exists as a terrorist organization, particularly threatening in the areas of Syria where we and our allies don't really have much operating capability, i.e. those areas supposedly under the control of the Assad regime. In northeast Syria, where we're present with our allies, the Syrian Democratic Forces, referred to informally as the Kurds, in Iraq, where we have an eclectic combination of allies, the Islamic State still is much under pressure and can do little more, at least at present, than relatively minor terrorist operations. That and the counterterrorism business is relative success. So how did it work out so well when Afghanistan and other places didn't? First of all, we didn't commit large American forces. This Americanizes the war. It puts a huge pressure on our own population, and it can be counterproductive in winning loyalties of our local partners because they all are afraid that we will move in. Secondly, we didn't try to convert the hearts and minds of the people we were working with. We live with the fact that our Kurdish Syrian partners were offshoot of the PKK. We didn't try to persuade them to stop having this Marxist, Leninist, Kurdish nationalist ideology. We just asked them to try to put it on the shelf during the fight against the Islamic State, which they more or less did. The same thing in Iraq. We didn't ask for the Kurds in the north and the central government to solve all of the problems that divided them. They didn't, and they came to blows militarily in 2017, but we managed to fix it. We didn't expect the Shia militias, many of whom were loyal to Iran, to give up their loyalties and basically fold into the Iraqi army. We lived with them and in a nervous way, quasi-cooperated with them on the margins. It was all to the greater good of defeating the Islamic State. With the populations, we put millions and billions of dollars, us and our European partners, because remember, this was an 80-nation coalition, and I'll come to that, into, first of all, humanitarian assistance, secondly, early recovery in areas that have been devastated by the Islamic State and our own fighting and particularly bombing there, and then enough assistance to, if you will, buy the loyalties, or at least the quiet cooperation of the local populations as we continue to work with our partners operating in those areas against the Islamic State. We weren't trying to turn these countries into Denmark. We didn't care all that much who went to school or who didn't go to school. Naturally, on the margins, we'd urge people to go to school. We would give speeches about democracy. Actually, I didn't, but most of my compatriots did. And but we didn't take it all that seriously. The main goal was to focus on pushing back. This is a different form of counter insurgency and counterterrorism than what we had seen after 9/11. There, we weren't trying to win, at least temporarily, hearts and minds. We were trying to convert hearts and minds. That was the main goal of what we were doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. The military action, even when it involved, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, many hundreds of thousands of people, that was a supporting line of effort, as the military calls it, to fend off that part of the population that didn't want to be converted by us. And we did that with limited success in Iraq, and in the end, zero success, of course, in Afghanistan. In the fight against the Islamic State, all we asked for was that our partners wanted to fight against the Islamic State, and they would not put their other political and security interests above that one issue. And all in all, it worked out. We had our bad moments when the Turks came in to go after the SDF Kurds in 2019, when we got into a mini war with Iran and Iraq a bit later, and again, when Erbil in the north of Iraq and the Baghdad central government went to war briefly over Kirkuk in 2017. But we managed to fix all of these things because we all had a common interest in fighting the Islamic State, A, and B, unlike before, and I was involved in these things before, we weren't trying to dictate how the Kurds in Erbil and the Arabs in Baghdad should solve their problems, what the outcome of the PKK Turkish insurgency would be, how the Iranian Shia, the Iranian supported Shia movements could be persuaded to give up their ties to Iran. We simply asked them to put it on the back burner while they work with us, or directly or indirectly. And that is what we will do in this new confrontation with the forces that are trying to tear down the system. We will apply those lessons. We will build up international coalitions. We have one now with Ukraine. We had one with the Islamic State, 80 nations and organizations. And these countries actually did significant military operations, particularly air and training, and they provided a great deal of the funding. It wasn't just the United States. So this was a real effort. It wasn't just a show effort. And we're seeing some of the same thing in Ukraine, although there the US role up until now is somewhat bigger in terms of supporting the Ukrainians. But in terms of taking the pain, it is our partners around the world, beginning in Europe, who are taking more of the pain. So there is a distribution of overall effort, and that is what we need as well, because no matter how powerful we are, and the United States remains very, very powerful, we cannot commit our people to constant foreign adventures and faraway places if we cannot point to the people involved on the ground who are closer to it, doing at least as much. We have a wonderful ally in Zelensky and his great Ukrainian fighters right now. We had wonderful allies in the Syrian Kurds and all of the Iraqis in the struggle against the Islamic State. Now, how does this all end? To quote General Dave Petraeus then in 2003 on the road to Baghdad. There is a counterinsurgency expert at the National Defense University, David Uchko, who just came out with a book, The Insurgent's Dilemma. And he analyzed insurgencies, including the Islamic State insurgency, and quasi-insurgent operations on both sides, including some of Russia's actions in Syria, Georgia, and elsewhere. And he said that the efforts by the state to carry out the US military's manual published after repeated failures in Iraq, 23-4, which focused correctly on the population, but also focused on transforming that population through what we call phase 4 transition to a democratic state, into a vibrant economy and local governance and everything. He found that states actually didn't adhere very much to this, despite much urging and much money from the United States and in many cases our European allies in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But he found that they usually survived by outlasting the insurgents. And there is a dichotomy here. We, the United States, are impatient. Despite our tremendous military power, the thing you need most in an insurgency or a major counterterrorist operation is a large number of boots on the ground. And the weak point in our military is we don't have a large army. We have a relatively small army that is trained day and night to carry out rapid, decisive, offensive warfare. What does that look like? It looks like what the Ukrainians just did in the last 2 weeks, because we helped train them and gave them the intelligence, and they're pretty good at it on their own. That's what our army is good at. It's not good at sitting in year after year in some foreign country. And therefore, we get impatient and we don't want to wait out the insurgents. But the countries that do wait out the insurgents, we're seeing, for example, slowly but surely, a transition, and we saw this in the latest fighting in Gaza, between a split between Hamas and the Islamic State. The Islamic State, supported by Iran, constantly trying to provoke new battles with Israel. Hamas beginning to think, do we need another destructive campaign? That's an example of slowly moving from confrontation to something like a ceasefire. We've seen this repeatedly between the PKK and Turkey over their 40-year confrontation. They have had several major ceasefires. They then, from 2015 on, went back into fighting in some areas. It works. There's a pro-PKK party that, with a lot of problems, is still in the Turkish parliament. There is a de facto ceasefire in northeast Syria. In other areas in northern Iraq, it doesn't. But that's what we will see increasingly. And it's not just in the counterinsurgency field, it's in the field of how we will deal with Russia and China. On some issues, we will collaborate. For example, some space stuff, perhaps, regulating weapons of mass destruction, as we did in the Cold War, perhaps climate. On others, we will compete, as we're doing with China. We can't decouple from the economy that we're in trade. And in some areas, we will clash, including very dramatically right now in Ukraine. At the end of the day, however, the odds are with us, but this requires our population and the populations of our partners and allies to understand, first of all, what's at stake, which is the whole world we've created since 1945, and secondly, how we're going to go about winning this thing. And there's still a bit of clarification needed by not only our leadership, but other leaderships as well. But that also requires education. That's what universities are for. That's what evenings like this one are for. So once again, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for this great overview, Jim. I already have 3 questions, and I'd like to ask my participants to type their questions, and I will directly ask Jim. So you portrayed the global system that the US is leading, and it's one where relatively there is a rule of law, there is an international system that countries need to abide by laws. And this global system is being challenged by people who want a little bit of anarchy so they can get away with whatever they want, like invading another country. So right this moment, especially what you said about the health of the importance of the populations and being educated about what's at stake as they elect people in semi-democratic countries or ones that are really sliding. So in my own research, I look at a lot of the disinformation and information. And what I'm seeing is that there is massive, massive, massive campaigns that these same powers, China and Russia in particular, but others like emerging ones in the Middle East, that are putting a huge, huge stress on the system. What do you think will happen, given that from where I stand, we're not really taking on that informing the population challenge? We're letting them manipulate our populations and their populations in a large, in my opinion, like from where I see it, especially the Arab world, definitely, we're not even waging a serious effort there.
Yeah, the administration has, first of all, we're still waiting for them to publish their national security strategy.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to get too far ahead of that. It's being briefed in classified form in Congress now. I suspect it will be very similar to the awkwardly termed, I think it was interim national security strategy review that they published at the beginning of the administration, which, as I said, did talk a lot about great power or strategic competition with Russia and China. The problem is you have to fill out the bones of this idea with meat, and that's complicated because it requires, among other things, the population, our population, understanding the larger issues. Again, I think I would give the administration good marks for the way it has handled Ukraine. And to some degree, the information policy to the American public. But frankly, the American media, which has covered this conflict dramatically and all in all well, has provided much of the information and motivation for the population to understand that there need to be sacrifices. But that's tough. I'm watching how the Europeans are doing it. They're facing bigger challenges, particularly with the cutoff in gas and probably oil. So they will suffer more without any doubt. And they're taking the leadership in all of the European countries is taking a more deliberate set of steps to preach. There's going to be pain. We're going to spread it as much as possible, and we're going to limit it, but it's all necessary, or what happened in Ukraine is going to happen next door. And because Ukraine, it's unfair, unlike the Middle East, or East Asia, or Africa, or Central America, the people in places like Germany and France look at what's happening in Ukraine. They say, hey, that looks like our neighborhood. That looks like my mother-in-law. And that's not that far away. And they're right. So they're having an easier time doing it than we are. Joe Biden is a child of the Cold War. He understands these things. The two key people in the Defense Department, Secretary Austin and General Milley, came up in the U.S. Army during the Cold War. They understand what's at stake. They understand how to do this. And I'm pretty confident that we will maintain and this is kind of uncommon right now, but so far it's been holding a bipartisan approach to staying the course, including with some pain, as we had with the gas prices this summer, to maintain support for Ukraine. I just can't see us backing down.
One question, and I think you're perfect to answer this, is like you have served so many administrations for an entire career, and one of my students is actually asking, as different administrations have different strategies, we just finished with Trump and now we're with Biden, are we at risk of having our basically our national security agenda coming across as incongruent, or how do you see that transition from one administration to another?
It's a very good question. It's a complicated question. I will try to be reassuring, but I will sound artificial and somewhat corny. America, despite having lost 100,000 troops since World War II in these conflicts, has benefited tremendously, as has the rest of the world, from this relative global peace. Now, it may not look like a peaceful globe since 1945, and some of the people who are listening tonight, and certainly larger audiences, would say, not in my country in this period, well, not what I did in 2004 and such. That's true. But The model of the comparison is with 1914 to 1945, when the whole world was torn by ideological conflicts, by world wars, by the Great Depression, by the Spanish flu, again and again, waves of great German inflation, waves and waves of things came across the world all at once, and everybody was impacted. We haven't seen anything like that because our system was built to avoid it. And so far it's held together. That's an argument all of us who have studied this or experienced it need to make to our populations, because that's both the strength and the vulnerability. The strength is once free peoples decide on a common cause, nothing can stop them. You try to fight a really tough war with a totalitarian leadership, and you see what you have with the Russian army today. And you try to fight a war even with outnumbered and outgunned, with people who believe they're fighting for their freedom and their nation state, and with a democratic leader who's constantly in a khaki t-shirt on the front lines, you get people who are a multiplier factor. So that's the good news. The bad news is populations are fickle. Having gone through the Vietnam War, we went through, the population held through very terrible times when the administration was pursuing bad policies. Then in the end, when we were pursuing good policies and we had either gotten almost everybody out, and then in 1975, everybody out, and it was fairly successful, the population just decided no more of Vietnam. And that's the problem. It's a constant struggle because all populations of all of the states of Europe, of East Asia, of the Middle East have choices. They can sit out conflicts, they can join the other side, they can make a minimal effort, they can try to avoid pain rather than accept and embrace sacrifice. It all depends on how good the leadership is and how committed the population either is or can be. Thus, as always in war, it's a political process, and that's what we're facing now. What Putin is doing with the gas cutoff, that's his blitzkrieg. His military blitzkrieg didn't work. We'll see how his gas blitzkrieg turns out.
So this is related to another question, which is, what do you think are the possibilities of China invading Taiwan?
Okay, I'll get to that in a second, but let me finish that last question because I realized I didn't actually answer it. Each administration comes in, and boy, the Biden administration sets records on this one, saying everything the guy did before me was awful. We're going to totally have a new, better foreign policy designed for the interests of the American people. The basic constraints and necessities of running a global collective security system have remained the same from administration to administration. The details have changed. The closest thing, and it's the exception that proves the rule, to a guy in charge who didn't really believe in the system was Donald Trump, who I worked for. He had grave doubts, but every time he really decided to act on those grave doubts, everybody would come in, his friends in the Senate, his friends in the administration, his friends in the donor community, and say, Donald, knock it off. No, you can't pull your troops out of Syria. No, you can't leave NATO. No, you can't go off on a jet ski with the dictator of North Korea and continue to get our support. And Trump went along with it. He, in his own way, continued the consistent foreign policy that we have maintained for many years. Barack Obama had a certain distaste for this collective security role. He was constantly looking for a way out of it, a way to go transcend it. He never quite succeeded, and he kept on bouncing back to it. And I think with Biden, we don't even have to worry. This guy has been doing this for 60 years. So therefore, while you can criticize some of the specific actions, and particularly the execution, where the Afghanistan withdrawal is the best example I've seen in decades, the point is, on the larger sense, it will be okay. Now on Taiwan, nobody knows. I would say that unlike the ideological importance of Taiwan to a China that sees it as its graduation ceremony from breaking out of the shackles of its 19th century colonial status, that's very real, and nobody should deny that who's worked with the Chinese. But it's not Ukraine. The whole essence of Russia in its history, from when the Rus were red-headed, that's where the word comes from, Vikings, and the Orthodox Christianity that came in from the south, is tied up as much in Kiev as it is in Moscow. You cannot sever the two from a historical, cultural, to some degree linguistic and historical standpoint. But also, the Ukraine, as I said, is 40 million population, over a third, or roughly almost a third that of Russia's. And they're a highly educated, very competent population. The country has tremendous resources, and it has a very important geographic position. Taiwan, not so much. Aside from this important ideological component, it allows China to break what we call the first island barrier, which is important from a defense standpoint. It played a big role in both World War II and the Cold War, these idea of the island chains in the Pacific. It's how you think of the Pacific. In Europe, you think of the North German plain that stretches basically from, the English Channel to the steppes around Moscow. In Asia, you think about the island chains. So there's a benefit to that. They're pretty competent people, but what's 40 million more, 25 million more Chinese going to do with a country with 1.4 billion? So China has to think of what's the advantage of doing this if I get in a major war and my army, which has never been tested, turns out to have the same flaws as Putin's army. And that the Taiwanese, all they have to do is just fight half as high as the Ukrainians. As we learned on D-Day, launching a invasion, and we put 160,000 troops ashore that first day, with the largest flotilla in history. The Chinese can't do anything like this. And even if we do not live up to Joe Biden's commitment to fight for the Taiwanese, all we have to do is have the 7th Fleet bobbing offshore, and much of the Chinese military capability is going to have to pull their punches in fear that we might change our mind any moment and have to maintain a defensive posture. It's a very complicated position for them to do. On the other hand, they may also decide that, and this is a change from how we're looking at things from half a decade ago. Half a decade, we were sure that the Chinese would catch up to us in the GDP, would gain through their Belt and Road Initiative far more diplomatic support around the world, and be militarily, at least in East Asia, stronger than us. We're just, and certainly technologically, competitive with us. None of those things seem to be coming true right now. And therefore, there's a risk that the Chinese might say, hey, we're slipping further behind. Maybe we better act now and roll the dice before we're even further behind. That's the big risk. No one can know. The Biden administration is right to announce that we will defend Taiwan, but it has to do more. And my friend Michelle Flournoy, the former Undersecretary of Defense, has a piece in Foreign Affairs just out describing in detail what needs to be done to make Taiwan a second Ukraine. And we haven't done that yet, and the Taiwanese haven't done that.
One question is, do you think that the polarization in Western democracies could be a weakness to the global collective security?
No, absolutely. But I'll have to say the polarization is a factor of political systems that get into do loops with each other. The United States is much more polarized on most issues internally as political parties, as media, as political commentators than the American people are. We see this with the abortion issue. There is a sweet spot, and it's measured in number of weeks, that you can, in all polls, and this has been true for decades, most Americans will land in. And what we're seeing is, through a messy political process, beginning right there in your state, something like this happening. So that's the anecdote to polarization is finding ways to have the people speak. We had a pretty significant challenge to our democratic processes just 2 years ago, but every single institution did exactly what we expected those institutions to do. The people, you can trust the people, you can trust the institutions. Don't get too concerned about the political parties. Also, people will come together. Germany has had a lot of polarization, yet the current German government, it's weakly led by its chancellor, Scholz, but despite that, it has a variety of parties from the left to the right, and it's holding together, and I think it will, despite a hit to the economy that we have not seen since the Depression.
Marta is asking, as someone who wants to enter the Foreign Service, what is some advice you have to those interested in pursuing this career path?
First of all, it is a life of service, not too different from that of the military, or as we used to say in the Catholic Church, taking orders. And thus it's both a vocation and an avocation. And the first thing is, if you have or are contemplating eventually having a significant other, bear in mind that there are huge challenges to that, because you're not only moving constantly, you're moving from country to country, where you with your diplomatic passport and your paycheck coming in from Washington, have a job regardless of where you are. Your significant other, and I speak from personal experience with myself and my family, may not. So therefore, you got to calculate that. The final thing is, you have to love challenge and adversity, and take a certain ironic pleasure in going months without any fresh vegetables, eating out of cans, sleeping in connexes, getting shot at, being cold and hungry or really hot, all for the service of, I would say, mankind, but that's an idealistic approach, but certainly for the United States of America. That's not for everybody, but a lot of people sign up every year and we get really good people.
Thank you. Following up on the Taiwanese question, what about the importance of microprocessors and computer technology manufactured in Taiwan, you think?
Right now, it's critically important. There's a major effort, as you know, we passed major legislation. I'm not making pitches for either the American political system in general, which has its problems, or this administration, but it's had some real successes recently in Congress, and one of them has been this new initiative to invest in and work on microchips and other related things in the United States. If we carry through with that, remain consistent, and the next administration picks up on it, we'll do fine, because we are still the technology center of the universe. But we also have laws, taxation, various levels of government, other strictures that tie us down. We have to be aware of that. This legislation is designed to clear the way, but we have to make sure that it will carry that out. And of course, that's another way to deter China. If we have a fallback capability without Taiwan, then the geostrategic benefit of moving that chess piece off of the map, or putting it on the Chinese side, is much less. That's how foreign policy, it's not totally rational, but there's a rational factor. And the Chinese know that right now, that is the microchip center of the universe. So that makes it important in a way that its population otherwise isn't.
I'm going to ask those who want to ask questions, or who have asked questions that I haven't yet answered. Please don't give me like a paragraph this big, because I need to be engaged. So just give me a short question that I can read. So if your question has not been read yet, don't give me a speech. Give me a short question, please. But in the meanwhile, I want to ask, we were talking about the coalition to defeat ISIS, and as somebody who's done a lot of counterterrorism work, it really, what do you do with our allies, some of the Arab Gulf allies in particular, who have essentially created this global problem of extremism everywhere, and who are also our allies, and who continue, as far as disinformation, misinformation against democratic movements and actors, continue to suppress these efforts. So how do we deal with this, Jim, so that we can really win this war of extremism?
It's two levels. One is, and let's be very specific, it's the Saudi regime, our government, there I go using regime again, after 1979. But there's a background to that. The House of Saud had a near-death experience in 1979 with the terrorist attack on Mecca. And it thus engaged in a, if you will, devil's bargain with, I would say, very, very fundamentalist and to some degree extreme elements of its religious clergy and that part of the population that identified with it, which is you can export your version of Salafist or Wahhabi Islam through funding schools and mosques and mullahs all over the Islamic world, as long as you don't try to do it here. And be aware, we will then connive with Washington and give them bases and ensure that our partners and allies in the Gulf gives them the bases and the wherewithal to go ahead and bomb the hell out of these people once they stop preaching and start pitching hand grenades. And that's the way this whole thing has come down. Now, Mohammed bin Salman, the current crown prince and de facto ruler, has taken major steps to move beyond this. Whether he will be successful or not is open to some question, but I certainly have spent enough time there in the last few years to know that he's serious about it and people around him are, and we're seeing a lot less of this proselytizing. Now, but the second problem is much greater. That is, to the extent that terrorism in the Middle East, Islamic terrorism, is a function of bad governance, undemocratic governance, and that's a problem, but we don't have a solution because we have tried every way but Sunday to help these countries become democratic, including marching in with huge armies, and none of them have worked out. Gee, let me count: Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and even Lebanon, which had a democracy that is slowly rotting away before us. And we have maintained a, we'll help the more moderate forces position for years, and that hasn't slowed down the collapse of the place. So I think we, to the extent we can provide a security shield against the various forces of disorder, which we more or less do, we can expand trade and other opportunities, and we can use our diplomacy to bridge between the various factions. A good example is one reason why Hamas didn't react this time to a mini war with Israel is that the United States acted forcefully and effectively a little over a year ago when fighting broke out between Israel and Hamas, and managed to get, with help from the Qataris, the Egyptians, and others, a solution. So that was, again, by, with, and through our various partners and finding a solution. The more of that you do, the cooler the temperature in the region and the more optimistic you should be. But you've come from the region, you've seen its bad days and good days, so you have your views too.
So, Jim, I have a really good question. Do you think that the US is perceived as reliable by our adversaries as well as our allies?
No. This is the problem with collective security. It's one of the Achilles heels. But it's a two-edged Achilles heel, if I can mix my metaphors, because the solution to it is you prove your alliance by going to everything up to total war to save a Tibet in 1950, which you don't really care about and you have no means of even getting to because it's on the other side of the Himalayas. It's not just Vietnam. Before Vietnam, we were in northern Laos, another place almost impossible to get to, with a GDP of maybe $5,000 for the whole population in 1961. We actually put troops on the ground. And so to prove that we are reliable, we rush around everywhere like a crazed fireman or woman, trying to put out fires however unimportant the places. And the reason that is necessary is, again, you get back to the 1930s. The United States and France and Britain and other serious countries looked at places like Abyssinia and Manchukuo and Sudetenland that they couldn't even find on maps, and said, why would we go to even limited war for those places? So, we're just going to let those folks work it out themselves. And then we woke up to see, planes with red rising suns over Pearl Harbor and spot stickers over downtown London. And we said, oops, we got that one wrong. We will learn that lesson and we'll start mixing it up in small countries. Only then we see that our populations aren't interested in endless wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan. There's no answer to this. It is a system weakness. And you have to do it by, if you pick and choose too much, then then you'll have Japan and France and Britain thinking they're no more important than Tibet. America can do without us and we'll just turn our back. And believe me, I've seen moments where they've distrusted us. On the other hand, and Jordan will Jordan or Israel or Saudi Arabia or the Emiratis will immediately think, okay, they don't care about us anymore. If we don't respond to every, a good example is, the Saudis, and I was there not too long ago and talked to Aramco and to the government, and they're still very troubled that we didn't essentially go to war with Iran over the attack on the Aramco installation. Well, I talked to the Aramco people who assured me that they fixed everything within 2 days and that Saudis, export oil hardly dropped. And I want to say, look, we're your 911 if 500,000 troops march into your country, like in the case of Kuwait, where we didn't even have a security relationship, but we still did it. We're your 911 for big things. It's kind of like insurance policies, medical and others. You have a deductible. Your deductible in collective security is you got to take care of some of these minor problems yourself. We'll sell you the anti-aircraft missiles. We'll give you some support. We'll send out a 4-star general to talk to you about doing better next time. But we're not going to go to war for the small stuff. But we're just there for the big stuff. But we are there for the big stuff. But the problem is it's hard to persuade people of that because every president gets to make his or someday her decision.
Well, the next one is custom tailored for you as our former ambassador to Turkey. How would you gauge the current status of our U.S.-Turkish relationship? Do you believe Ankara is permanently in a post-Ataturk era?
I wouldn't say it's in a post-Ankara, post-Ataturk era. Just as I would say Donald Trump has proven the resiliency of our collective security system, President Erdogan has proven the resiliency of the Ataturk political system, which is broadly democratic, broadly oriented towards the West and away from the Middle East, and focused on integration into the global economy in a market-based system. Those are the basics. The bulk of the Turks, even today, after 20 years of a, quote, religious government, certainly in the major cities, wearing a headscarf is optional, and that's the most anybody does. And the Turks going deep into, not the countryside, but certainly the smaller cities in the hinterland of the country, their focus, their orientation, their relatives, it's all Europe. It's not the Hajj. It's not, let's go to Beirut and have fun if you've got money, or let's go to Egypt and, and wallow in the glories of our Arab and Islamic past. Nobody thinks that way in Turkey. They want to go to Paris. They want to go visit their cousin in Berlin. And that's the basic orientation of the country. Erdogan hasn't changed that. I'm not so sure he wants to change it. The problem with Turkey that goes beyond Erdogan is it is a very, very powerful country in a very insecure region with not only major predators, Russia and Iran, but also Islamic terrorist movements from time to time, and of course the PKK. But it also has, and here the PKK gets mentioned again, it has local problems that are of great concern with former remnants of the Ottoman Empire, the Kurds, the Greeks, the Armenians, who have very privileged audiences in Western Europe, in the United States, which means that the Turks are not, do not feel very well at home with their partners and allies. This is a recipe for running a somewhat independent foreign policy. We don't like our partners and allies to run somewhat independent foreign policy. De Gaulle did it. It drove us crazy. On the other hand, when we really needed him in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was there. When we really need Erdogan, like in the Ukraine crisis, he's 85% there. He closed the Dardanelles under the Montreux Convention for any Russian naval reinforcements, which means that there goes Russia's naval leg of their campaign against Ukraine. But, and you'll hear this every day in Washington, he's told NATO they're not welcome either. Well, under the Montreux Convention, you know, the US Navy can maintain at best a couple of ships for a short period of time in the Black Sea, and then they have to sail away because that's the way the rules are. So even if he let them come in, thus provoking Russia, it wouldn't have had any military impact. That's the kind of thing you get with Erdogan. He does things that are irritating, and what he'll say is, okay, but you don't have a Russian Navy to worry about, my friend Zelensky, and we don't hear Zelensky bitching about the closing of the Dardanelles to NATO. The same thing with the grain. He hasn't implemented the NATO sanctions against Russia. On the other hand, that's enabled him to cut a deal with Putin that, remember, 2 months ago, we were talking about half the world starving. Now the Ukrainians are shipping out, you know, hundreds of thousands of tons, if not a day, certainly a week. And we have Erdogan to thank for that. But he gets no love because his favorite activity is to provoke Western Europe and Washington, and nobody does it better than him at more cost to him. So it's going to be okay, but it's a real roller coaster with him.
3 last questions.
Sure.
I'm gonna no.
All right, bundle them. Yeah, bundle them's good.
Bundle them together. Should the US get back into the Iran deal? Is there a solution to the Kurdish question? And what possible future economic recession, with a possible future economic recession, what is the possibility of sustaining a long-term military equipment support to Ukraine? So Ukraine, the Kurdish question, and Iran.
Yeah, this is always a test of my advanced age. Can I maintain 3 separate questions? Okay, let's start with Iran. My biggest gripe with Donald Trump, although taking out Qasem Soleimani was a truly bold move that almost got us in a war when they started firing ballistic missiles at us, but all is well that ends well, and, you know, good luck was with Trump that day, and we basically, you know, generated a major reverse, to quote Foreign Minister Zarif. Later, it's like taking out a whole division, taking out Qasem Soleimani. So, but the biggest mistake Trump did was pulling out of the JCPOA. The reason was that was one less problem. We've got enough problems in the Middle East. That was not a solution to Iran's long-term desire to have a nuclear weapons capability, or at least threaten a nuclear capability. They are absolutely all in on that, but it would have pushed it off for a few years. And there's something to be said in diplomacy for pushing things off for a few years. It also was not, and there was some of the Obama administration thought so, transform Iran into a Denmark. Again, this is the crazy philosophy that has sent us off on so many crusades. At least this one wasn't an armed crusade, it was a negotiating crusade. But, you know, you look at Obama, you look at Kerry, on their weak moments, they really thought they were going to achieve like a China flip, like Kissinger and Nixon going to China, except 40 years later, we realized that didn't turn out so good either in the long term. You know, enemies are enemies, I'm sorry. Okay, the Kurdish question, first of all, there are many Kurdish questions. There's a basic Kurdish question. They are a large minority in 4 Middle Eastern countries, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and they have a strong sentiment of unity and of opposition to central governments and are perceived as potential threats in all of those countries. Only in one, ironically, Turkey, is much of the population integrated in terms of marriage and location with the rest of the country. Everywhere else, they are an enclave like the Albanians were an enclave in Serbia called Kosovo. It's a similar situation in some respects. Yeah, if Iran can be kept under control, which requires some American effort, I'm most optimistic in Iraq because there is a constitutional basis. Turkey has had repeated ceasefires with the PKK and the pro-PKK People's Democratic Party still remains in the parliament. So there is a potential opening, but it would require Erdogan to find a new coalition partner than the one he has now, the National Action Party, which is bitterly anti-Kurdish of any sort. And in Syria, that's just such a sub element of a huge set of questions about Serbia that no sane person would try to answer. Either what happens to the Kurds, what happens to you know, the Tariq Sham in Idlib, whatever happens to, you know, the people in the southwest, and on and whatever happens to the Islamic State. Syria is just a puzzle. In terms of Ukraine, we must, any solution to this war sooner or later will become diplomatic. Mm-hmm. And any part of that diplomacy has to be a no kidding guarantee that Ukraine will be able to defend itself and call on the international community. There are various ways to do this. One is an international peacekeeping force like we have in southern Lebanon. It would have to be stronger than that one, which is notorious for its failings vis-a-vis Hezbollah. It would probably have to have at least some American troops like we have in the Sinai, a battalion of troops still there in a peacekeeping mission, something like that. And a long-term commitment to give Ukraine modern weapons, air force, air defenses, and other things. We'd be careful about long-range systems that could, you know, turn the skies over Moscow light in the night. But beyond that, there's going to be half part of it, because Putin will never give up until it is clear to Putin and to much of his population, including the key figures around him, that trying to take on Ukraine is like taking, in fact, it'll be tantamount to taking on all of NATO. And that's going to be tough to make that clear without provoking Russia into feeling once again, as to some degree we did in the 1990s, that we're pushing against their borders. So no one knows the specifics, but certainly in one or another way, that will have to be a component.
All right. Well, Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you so much for sharing all this amazing, I don't know how you keep it all, multiple history lessons with us. We are so grateful that you shared this experience, your wisdom, your knowledge with all of us here in Kansas. We don't get as many amazing speakers as you do in Washington. So we're really, really grateful for you making the time to speak with us.
Well, it's a great state, it's a great university, and we're proud of everyone everywhere in the United States.
And I should mention that you actually refused to even take an honorarium. You wanted to do this as a service, and we're really grateful for your service, both to our country, but also with giving us your time this evening. Thank you.
No, absolutely. This is really important. This touches all of us, our children and our children's children.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nadia.
Thank you.
Ma salama.
Ma salama.